the night Las Vegas held its breath. In the mid-1960s, Las Vegas was not merely a city of neon lights and velvet curtains. It was a living organism fueled by risk, ambition, and unspoken rules. Behind every glittering marquee stood power brokers who never appeared on posters, men whose authority was not announced but felt. On one particular night at the Sands Hotel, that invisible power pressed itself into the room so heavily that even the clinking of glasses seemed afraid to make a sound. On stage stood Dean Martin, dressed in his immaculate tuxedo, posture loose, expression relaxed, the very image of effortless charm. To the audience, he looked like a man who had nothing in the world to worry about. But Dean Martin had lived long enough to know that calm surfaces often hid dangerous depths. The band eased into memories are made of this, the familiar melody drifting through the smoke-filled showroom like a shared memory. Couples leaned closer, smiles softened, and the room settled into the rhythm of comfort. Dean sang with that unmistakable warmth, his voice smooth, unhurried, almost conversational. This was his gift, making every listener feel as though he was singing only for them. Yet halfway through the song, something shifted. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of change that seasoned performers feel in their bones before their minds can explain it. Dean's eyes moved instinctively toward the front row. There in plain sight sat a man no one ever introduced out loud. His presence alone commanded silence. On the table in front of him, resting casually as though it were no more dangerous than a cigarette case, lay cold steel, not pointed, not raised, just there. A message without words, a reminder of who truly owned the night. Dean's voice did not crack, but he stopped singing. The band continued, professionals to the core, yet the audience felt the pause immediately. Laughter vanished. Breath was held. Hundreds of people stared, unsure whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or the opening move of something far darker. Las Vegas in 1965 was not forgiving to those who misread a room. Every casino, every headline act, every glowing sign owed its existence to arrangements most people preferred not to examine too closely. Dean knew this better than almost anyone. He had grown up in Steubenville, Ohio, surrounded by men who lived by codes stricter than law. His father's barber shop had doubled as a quiet gathering place for gamblers and hustlers, and as a boy, Dean learned early how power really worked. You listened more than you spoke. You watched hands as closely as faces. And above all, you never let fear show, because fear invited cruelty. But fear was never Dean Martin's currency. On stage, he was untouchable not because he was reckless, but because he was honest. He did not posture. He did not challenge. He simply was. And in that moment, staring at a man whose reputation alone could empty rooms, Dean made a decision that would ripple through Las Vegas for years. Instead of retreating, instead of pretending he hadn't seen what everyone else clearly had, Dean smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a forced one. It was that familiar, disarming grin, the one that told audiences he was exactly where he wanted to be. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until he stood at the edge of the stage. The distance between him and the front row table disappeared. The room felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Dean lifted the microphone and spoke lightly, his tone playful yet unmistakably steady. He joked about unexpected talent in the audience, about surprise auditions on a Las Vegas night, letting a thin thread of humor stretch across the tension. Nervous laughter followed, unsure but grateful for permission to breathe. Humor, after all, was Dean's armor, but beneath the joke was something sharper, a refusal to be intimidated in his own house. Behind the scenes, members of the Rat Pack understood exactly what was happening. Sammy Davis Jr., watching from the wings, felt his chest tight. Sammy knew the rules of Vegas intimately, and he knew how rarely those rules bent. This was not bravado, this was something deeper. Dean was not insulting the man in the front row. He was acknowledging him on equal footing. In a world built on fear, respect was the rarest currency of all. The silence stretched, heavy and unforgiving. The man at the table did not move. He did not smile. He did not reach for the gun. His eyes stayed locked on Dean, measuring, weighing. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. And then, almost imperceptibly, the man's expression shifted. Just a fraction, not amusement, not surrender, recognition. The kind reserved for someone who understands the game and chooses to play it differently. Dean stepped back, reclaimed the microphone, and the band slid seamlessly into the next number. Applause came slowly at first, tentative, then stronger, as if the audience had collectively realized they were still alive, still part of a show, still witnesses to something extraordinary. To most, it looked like a joke handled well. To those who knew, it was a quiet standoff that could have ended careers or lives. Dean finished the set as though nothing unusual had happened, closing with that. "Es amore," his voice warm, confident, unbroken. Backstage, however, the air was thick with unease. Word traveled fast in Vegas, and this night would not remain a secret. Dean lit a cigarette, his hands steady, his thoughts clear. He had not challenged power, he had defined himself against it. The knock on the dressing room door that followed was inevitable, and when his manager warned him that he had made not just an impression but a potential enemy, Dean only smiled. He had lived his life by a simple rule: never bow on your knees when you can stand on your feet. That night marked the beginning of something larger than a single confrontation. It was the moment Las Vegas realized that Dean Martin was not just a singer with charm, not just a member of the Rat Pack, but a man who understood fear and refused to let it dictate his choices. What happened after the show would test that resolve in ways no spotlight ever could. And the city, watching closely, waited to see whether courage could truly coexist with power. The silence after the applause. The applause that followed Dean Martin off the stage felt strangely hollow, as if the room itself hadn't yet decided whether it had just witnessed entertainment or survival. Behind the curtain, away from the glow of chandeliers and the reassuring noise of approval, the Sands Hotel revealed its other face, the one made of narrow hallways, hushed voices, and eyes that watched without ever seeming to blink. Dean walked slowly, not because he was afraid, but because rushing would have betrayed the truth. That moments like this demanded control, not speed. The cigarette between his fingers burned steadily as he inhaled, the smoke curling upward like a signal flare meant only for himself. He replayed the scene in his mind, not with regret, but with precision, measuring every word, every pause, every glance, because in Las Vegas, memory was currency and mistakes were never forgotten. His manager hovered nearby, talking too much and saying nothing at all, the nervous energy pouring out of him in fragments of warning and fear. Dean listened politely, nodding just enough to keep the peace, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. He had not challenged a man, he had challenged an expectation. The unspoken belief that entertainers were decorations, valuable, yes, but ultimately replaceable. Dean had refused that role, not with anger or threats, but with humor and dignity, and that refusal carried weight far beyond the stage. In the quiet of his dressing room, the laughter of the audience felt distant, almost irrelevant. This was the real moment, the one no ticket had been sold for, where consequences decided whether courage would be rewarded or punished. The knock on the door came softly, almost respectfully, which unsettled everyone except Dean himself. He recognized the sound immediately, not the knock of a fan or a staff member, but of someone delivering a message they already knew would be heard. When the door opened and a well-dressed associate stepped inside, the room seemed to shrink. No raised voices followed, no threats, no overt displays of power. That was never how it worked. Power announced itself by how little it needed to say. The request was simple. The man from the front row would like a word. No timeline, no pressure, just inevitability. Dean smiled, not out of arrogance but understanding. He had known this moment was coming the second he stepped forward on stage. Avoidance would have been interpreted as weakness, hesitation as fear. Neither option suited him. The walk through the back corridors of the Sands felt longer than it was, every footstep echoing off walls lined with stories that never made headlines. Dean passed employees who suddenly found reasons to look away, men who understood exactly where he was going and why. This was the hidden Las Vegas, the one tourists never saw, where deals were struck without contracts and reputations were earned without applause. When he entered the room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The man sat calmly, hands folded, expression unreadable, the gun no longer on display. That, more than anything, told Dean he had already crossed the most dangerous part of the night. Open threats were easy. Silence was not. They spoke without theatrics, no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just two men acknowledging each other's boundaries. The message was clear without ever being stated outright. You embarrassed no one, but you reminded everyone that respect must be mutual. Dean did not apologize because apologies would have rewritten the story in the wrong direction. Instead, he spoke plainly about performance, about the stage, about the unspoken contract between entertainer and audience. He made it clear that he had no interest in power games, only in doing his job with integrity. The room remained quiet for a long time after he finished speaking, the kind of quiet that forces honesty. What followed surprised everyone who later heard the story secondhand. There was no threat, no warning, no promise of retaliation. Instead, there was a subtle shift, a grudging acknowledgement that courage delivered without insult was something even dangerous men could respect. When Dean stood to leave, he felt no triumph, only relief, not because he had won, but because he had stayed true to himself in a situation designed to strip that away. Outside, the casino floor buzzed as if nothing had happened. Gamblers laughing, glasses clinking, the city oblivious to how close the night had come to tipping into legend for all the wrong reasons. In the days that followed, the story spread quietly, reshaped with each retelling. Some said Dean had stared danger in the face without blinking. Others claimed he had diffused a moment that could have ended careers or lives by refusing to play the expected role. What mattered more than the details was the lesson it left behind. Courage, when paired with humility, could disarm situations brute force never could. Dean returned to the stage the next night as if nothing had changed, singing with the same ease, the same warmth, but those who knew looked at him differently now. He was no longer just the king of cool. He was proof that dignity could survive even in places built on fear. And somewhere in the shadows of Las Vegas, men who controlled fortunes and futures took note. Not because Dean Martin had defied them, but because he had reminded them of something rare. That real strength did not need to shout. It only needed to stand its ground. The weight of respect. By the third night after the incident, Las Vegas had done what it always did best. It smiled, glittered, and pretended nothing unusual had happened, while underneath the surface, every serious player quietly adjusted their expectations. Dean Martin felt it the moment he stepped back into the Sands showroom. The air was the same, the lights just as warm, the tables just as full, yet something invisible had shifted. It was not hostility, and it certainly was not admiration in the conventional sense. It was awareness. The kind that comes when people realize a man is not just a performer filling time between drinks, but someone who understands the invisible lines and chooses, carefully, when to step over them without erasing who he is. Dean had always carried himself with ease, but now that ease felt heavier, not as a burden, but as responsibility. Backstage, conversations lowered when he passed. Musicians who had played Vegas for decades looked at him with something close to disbelief, because they understood how rare it was for a situation like that to end without blood, contracts being canceled, or careers quietly disappearing. Dean didn't mention the night, not even to those closest to him. Silence, he knew, was part of respect. Talking too much would cheapen what had happened, turning something meaningful into gossip. Instead, he focused on the work. He rehearsed, joked with the band, adjusted his cufflinks, and stepped on stage each night with the same calm presence that had always defined him. To the audience, he was still the man who made everything feel effortless. Only a few sensed that the ease now carried depth. It was during one of those evenings that Sammy Davis Jr. joined him backstage, eyes sharp with concern masked by humor. Sammy had spent his life navigating rooms far more dangerous than they appeared, and he knew what courage cost in places like this. Without directly mentioning the incident, he spoke about pressure, about expectations, about how Vegas had a way of testing men in ways no stage ever could. Dean listened quietly, nodding, offering a half-smile that said more than words ever could. He understood Sammy's unspoken question, was it worth it? Dean didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. The fact that he was still standing, still performing, still himself, that was the answer. As the nights passed, subtle signs began to emerge. The front row remained clear of intimidation, replaced instead by attentive silence. Deals were honored without complication. Invitations that once came with strings now arrived clean, respectful. It wasn't friendship, and it certainly wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. In a city where fear was often mistaken for loyalty, Dean had introduced something more difficult to manage, self-respect. The men who controlled Vegas understood force. They understood money. What they rarely encountered was a man who refused to bend without ever trying to dominate. That combination unsettled them more than defiance ever could. Dean reflected on this often in the quiet moments after a show, when the laughter faded and the smoke cleared. He had spent his career making people comfortable, giving them an escape from their worries, but this experience reminded him that comfort, when paired with honesty, could also be disarming. He thought back to his childhood, to the men who sat in his father's shop speaking in half-sentences and knowing looks. Those men respected two things above all else: reliability and backbone. You didn't have to be loud, you just had to be consistent. On that stage, in that moment, Dean had been exactly that. Rumors continued to swirl, as they always did, growing larger with each retelling. Some said the man from the front row had deliberately tested Dean, curious to see whether the legend was real. Others claimed it was a misunderstanding inflated by fear. The truth, as always, sat somewhere in between, known only to those who had been there. What mattered was not the story, but the result. Dean Martin's name began circulating in different conversations now, not as someone to be watched, but as someone to be left alone. In Las Vegas, that distinction was everything. By the end of the week, Dean understood something profound. Courage does not announce itself with confrontation. It reveals itself through consistency. He had not changed the rules of Vegas, nor had he tried to. He had simply refused to let those rules rewrite who he was. Standing under the spotlight night after night, he realized that the greatest power he possessed was not fame or charm, but the ability to remain himself regardless of who was watching. And in a city built on illusions, that authenticity was the rarest act of all. As the curtain closed on another flawless performance, Dean took a slow bow, the applause washing over him like a familiar tide. To the audience, it was just another unforgettable night. To the city of Las Vegas, it was a quiet acknowledgement that respect, once earned without fear, was something even the most powerful men hesitated to challenge. The legacy no one could touch. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges, but some moments refuse to be dulled, no matter how many years pass. Long after the night Las Vegas held its breath, long after the rumors had settled into half-remembered legends whispered by bartenders and backstage hands, the impact of what Dean Martin had done continued to ripple quietly through the city. Dean himself rarely thought about it anymore, not because it lacked meaning, but because he had never lived his life looking backward. He believed that a man was only as strong as his next choice, and every night he stepped onto the stage, he chose the same thing: grace over fear, humor over ego, and dignity over submission. What changed most after that week was not how people treated Dean in public, but how they spoke about him when they believed he wasn't listening. In dressing rooms and private offices, his name was mentioned with a particular tone, one that blended admiration with caution. Not because he was dangerous, but because he was unmovable. In a city where leverage defined relationships, Dean Martin became something rare, a fixed point. Casino executives learned quickly that pressure did not work on him. Subtle intimidation failed. Even lavish offers meant to steer him in certain directions were met with polite smiles and firm boundaries. Dean never raised his voice, never threatened, never postured. He simply remained consistent, and that consistency carried more authority than any show of force ever could. For those closest to him, especially Sammy Davis Jr., the deeper significance of the moment became clearer with time. Sammy had spent his life fighting for respect in rooms that were never built with him in mind, navigating danger not just from organized power, but from open prejudice. Watching Dean stand calmly in the face of unspoken threat had reinforced something Sammy already knew but rarely saw proven so cleanly: that courage did not always need a fist or a shout. Sometimes it only needed a man willing to say, "This is who I am, and I will not shrink." The Rat Pack thrived on bravado, jokes, and chaos, but beneath it all was a bond rooted in loyalty. That night strengthened it in ways no success ever could. As the years passed, Las Vegas transformed. Neon grew brighter, rules softened, and the city began rewriting its own mythology for tourists eager to believe it had always been glamorous and safe. Yet among those who remembered the old days, the story endured, not as a tale of confrontation, but as a lesson. Dean Martin had not humiliated power, he had humanized it. He reminded men accustomed to obedience that respect could not be taken, only recognized. In doing so, he quietly altered the balance, not just for himself, but for those who followed. Younger performers heard the story and understood that survival did not always mean compliance, that it was possible, even in the most unforgiving environments, to stand tall without becoming reckless. Dean never sought credit for this legacy. He continued singing, laughing, making audiences feel at ease because that had always been his gift. But beneath the charm lived something unshakable, a belief that fear was a poor foundation for any relationship, whether on stage or off. In interviews years later, when asked about Las Vegas and its darker chapters, he brushed them off with humor, deflecting attention away from moments that others would have turned into myths. That, too, was part of his strength. He did not need his courage celebrated to know it was real. When Dean Martin eventually stepped away from the spotlight, the city felt quieter for reasons few could articulate. It wasn't just the absence of a voice or a presence. It was the loss of a standard. He had shown that kindness did not mean weakness, that calm could coexist with authority, and that self-respect once claimed could not be stripped away, not by threats, not by power, not by fear. The night a Mafia Don tested him had become only one chapter in a much larger story, a story about a man who refused to let the world decide who he was allowed to be. And so the legacy remained, not carved into headlines or etched onto plaques, but carried in memory, passed quietly from one generation to the next. In a city built on illusion, Dean Martin left behind something real, a reminder that the strongest response to intimidation is not defiance, but unwavering authenticity. What courage leaves behind? Years later, when the smoke had thinned and the stories of old Las Vegas began to sound almost unreal to those who hadn't lived through them, Dean Martin would sometimes sit quietly after a show, listening to the echo of applause fade into memory. By then, the city had changed its face many times over, shedding skins like a restless creature eager to be rebayed for each new generation. The power that once ruled from shadowed tables had retreated, replaced by contracts, corporations, and polished public narratives. Yet Dean understood something few ever admitted out loud, that systems change, but human nature rarely does. Fear still existed, ego still demanded obedience, and courage was still tested in quieter, subtler ways. The difference was that Dean had already proven to himself and to others that fear did not have to win. What lingered most from that night was not the tension nor the danger, but the realization that integrity could ripple outward in ways no one could fully predict. Younger performers began approaching him not for career advice, but for reassurance. They spoke in half-questions, careful not to sound naive, asking how to survive rooms that expected submission disguised as opportunity. Dean never preached, he never dramatized. He simply told them the truth as he had lived it. Know who you are before someone else tries to decide it for you. He explained that courage wasn't about provoking confrontation, but about refusing to disappear when pressure arrived. His words carried weight because they were unadorned, shaped by experience rather than theory. Even those who had once believed power could bend anyone eventually adjusted their behavior around him. Meetings became straightforward. Agreements were honored without theatrics, not out of fear, but because Dean Martin had become inconvenient to manipulate. He was calm, consistent, and uninterested in games. In a world built on leverage, that made him untouchable. The irony was not lost on him. By refusing to seek control, he had gained a kind of freedom most powerful men never experienced. He could walk into any room, perform his craft, and leave without owing pieces of himself to anyone. That was his true victory. Privately, Dean reflected often on how close the line had been that night at the Sands, not with regret, but with gratitude. He knew that courage did not guarantee safety, only self-respect. He also knew that standing tall once did not exempt a man from being tested again. Life would always find new ways to ask the same question. Who are you when it matters? For Dean, the answer remained unchanged, whether facing a silent threat or a roaring crowd. He was a performer, yes, but more importantly, he was a man who refused to trade his dignity for comfort. As the Rat Pack era faded into legend, stories of wild nights and effortless cool often overshadowed the quieter truths beneath the glamour. Yet those who had watched closely understood that Dean Martin's greatest performance was not delivered through a microphone, but through restraint. He had shown that kindness could exist without weakness, that humor could diffuse what force could not, and that respect earned without fear lasted longer than any threat ever could. That lesson outlived the neon signs, the smoky rooms, and even the men who once believed they owned the night. In the end, Dean Martin didn't change Las Vegas by challenging its power structures head-on. He changed it by reminding everyone, performers, executives, and power brokers alike, that no amount of influence could outweigh a man who knew his worth. And long after the applause faded, that quiet truth remained, standing exactly where he had left it, unbowed and untouched. The quiet truth that outlived the night. By the time the final years of Dean Martin's career arrived, the world around him had softened its edges, but the lessons he carried had only grown sharper. Fame had long since stopped being intoxicating to him. It was simply a tool, a doorway that opened rooms where decisions were made. What mattered now was not how loudly his name was spoken, but how calmly it was received. Wherever he went, television studios, private events, charity gatherings, or intimate concert halls, there was an unspoken understanding that followed him like a shadow. Dean Martin was not a man to be pushed, not because he would push back harder, but because pushing him led nowhere. He had become, in the truest sense, immovable. Occasionally, someone would bring up that old night in Las Vegas, usually in a hushed tone, as if the story itself still carried weight. Dean would wave it off with a lazy smile, turning it into a joke, dissolving the seriousness before it could settle. But inside, he understood why the story refused to die. People needed reminders that courage didn't always wear a dramatic face. They needed proof that a man could survive pressure without becoming cruel, that dignity could exist even in environments designed to strip it away. Dean had never intended to become that symbol, but symbols often choose their men, not the other way around. In private conversations with friends like Sammy Davis Jr., Dean admitted something he rarely shared publicly, that the hardest part of that night wasn't the threat itself, but the choice it demanded. Fear would have been easier. Submission would have been safer. Even anger would have been understandable. But calm required certainty. Calm required knowing exactly who you were when everything around you suggested you should be someone else. That certainty didn't come from fame or bravado. It came from a lifetime of watching men rise and fall based on how much of themselves they were willing to trade for approval. As the years passed, Dean noticed how often people confused kindness with weakness. He saw it in younger performers and executives, even in powerful figures who relied on intimidation because they had never learned another language. His response was never correction, never confrontation. He simply lived differently. He showed that you could be generous without being naive, relaxed without being careless, and confident without being loud. That quiet consistency became his signature, more enduring than any song he ever recorded. When Dean Martin finally stepped away from the spotlight, the absence felt larger than expected. Las Vegas still glittered, shows still sold out, and legends continued to be manufactured for new audiences, but something essential had left with him. Not the glamour, not the nostalgia, but the reminder that true strength could sit comfortably inside a tuxedo and a smile. The night a Mafia Don tested him faded into history, but the truth it revealed remained present, unchallenged, undeniable. In the end, Dean's legacy was not defined by confrontation, but by composure. He proved that a man did not need to dominate to be respected, nor surrender to survive. He simply needed to stand exactly where he was, refuse to be moved, and let the world adjust around him. That lesson outlived the neon lights, the rumors, and the fear. And in a city once ruled by shadows, it stood as quiet proof that dignity, once claimed, could never be taken away.